If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the creepiest paranormal / supernatural thing you've seen in the woods, mountains, rural areas, at home, etc.? I and my mother were coming home from a Wednesday church Bible study. This was a weekly thing. We lived in a rural community, and we took the same route every time. This one Wednesday, halfway home, I see 6 to 7 small lights hovering in the distance over a tree line behind a farm. I got my mother's attention, and I begged her to stop the car at the farm driveway. The farm was within viewing distance. We get out of the car and watch light balls move up and down and right to left. I soon realized they were a lot further away, so I started to walk. My mother screamed at me to get in the car. I had never seen her that terrified, so I got back in the car, and we drove off. I never saw anything like that again, even though we never stopped taking that route. 2010 Woods of Arkansas. Still to this day, my friends and I get chills talking about it. About 5 or 6 of us were smoking in the back of my buddy's F-150 and pulled into a random spot off of some backwoods in Ozark, Arkansas. I'm talking about a population of, like, 1,500 people. I just recently moved there from a big city and didn't know much about animals at that age. After about 15 minutes of us being in these random-ass woods, I saw a set of eyes staring at us. Not knowing much, I just thought it was an animal or something in the woods. Like an owl, because it was about 10 or 12 feet in the air. But it didn't blink. After looking at it for about 30 seconds or so of this thing not blinking and me slowly focusing on it, I noticed it didn't have pupils either. Still, not freaking out yet, I point through the stoned laughs and conversation at the thing looking at us. I'm laughing too, like, what is that? They have all lived there for a long time or all their lives, so I figured one of them would know. Dead silence, nothing, there is not a single sound. No lights are on, so it is pitch black out there. Just lighters being light. These eyes were glowing yellow and not moving. Not blinking. A good 10 seconds went by, which felt like 10 minutes. I swear on my life, this thing went from being maybe 50 to 60 feet away to 15 feet away behind a tree in less than a second. My buddy made some salsa that we were munching on. And instantly, we were freaking out. It sounds ducking goofy, but it ducking teleported instantly. It didn't make a sound in a flash of a second, the eyes glue in the dark. We all saw that shit, and there was no explanation. I have even looked up to see if there are any animals that it could be, and possibly a bird or squirrel, but there is nothing. But my buddy looked it up recently after I told him this story and found that there is a myth about a creature with yellow eyes out near that area. I was camping in a remote area with my friends when we saw something incredibly creepy. We had just finished setting up our tents and starting a fire when we heard some rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, we thought it might be a small animal, but the sounds were too heavy and deliberate. As we watched, a tall, thin figure emerged from the trees. It was walking on 2 legs, but its gait was strange and lurching. It had long, spindly arms that reached almost to the ground, and its fingers looked like they could wrap all the way around a tree trunk. We were frozen in fear, watching as the figure slowly made its way towards us. As it got closer, we could see that it had a humanoid face, but its eyes were completely black, without any whites or pupils. It didn't make any noise, but we could feel a sense of dread emanating from it. Finally, it stopped about 20 feet away from us, just beyond the edge of the firelight. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching us with those blank, black eyes. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. We were all shaken up and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. To this day, we have no idea what we saw, but we all agree that it was the creepiest thing any of us have ever experienced. When I was 11, I went tent camping with teenage cousins on the Sioux Reservation. They lived on the reservation. We were in an area we had followed several trails to find. We were inside the tent, and they were telling me a story about shapeshifters as the sun was going down. Suddenly, there was a beautiful glow, like when the sun bursts out through clouds and makes everything golden. It highlighted shapes going by the tent and casting shadows, and it started as a nice experience. Then there was a loud boom, and the shadow of a large bird came right at us, and the tent fell down on top of us. They were genuinely scared, which made me even more terrified. We hightailed it back through those trails and went home in the dark, barely able to breathe because we were going so fast. I still don't know what happened or why, but I can tell you I don't go tent camping. I went backpacking for 3 days with some friends on January 1st of this year. First night I was there, I was sleeping in my 2-person tent with one of my buddies, and I started to hear something walking outside of the tent around 4 a.m., I think it's probably just some animal, there are elk everywhere, who knows, but I'm safe. I try going back to bed, but it sounds like whatever is out there just keeps pacing the tent back and forth. I turn my head so the back is facing the corner of the tent, and it felt like there was something moving its face into the tent trying to smell me. I stay very still, hoping whatever is there goes away. Then all of a sudden it stomps and just misses my head. I remain still and get the feeling of it moving its head in again. I quickly elbow it, but nothing was there, and I heard no more noises after that, not even running if I spooked it. I grab my pistol that is in the other corner and wake my buddy up and tell him the situation. I open the tent and look outside. Nothing. I still have no clue what that could have been and wish I had opened the tent when it was pacing. When I was younger, maybe like 5, I went to bed, and I woke up to the sound of something whispering. I thought nothing of it until I heard "Hey, PSST," and I looked up and saw a black dog with yellow eyes standing on 2 legs. I started screaming and crying and yelling for my parents, and when they came up, the thing hid behind a chair in my room. I was so scared that I slept with my parents for a week and never saw that thing again. I had multiple dreams about it, though. It always had this power that it could make me freeze and not be able to move, and he would always do it in front of my parents, and they never did anything. Really creepy shit. My mom doesn't like driving on the highway, so when I was a teenager, we'd take the back way when visiting my grandparents. There was one town we'd always pass through that gave us the creeps. It was very small, no grocery store, no gas station, just some houses, a church, and a community center that was weirdly nowhere near the rest of the town. A lot of main roads went near it, but not through it. It was the kind of place that most people didn't pass through. We never saw anyone on the street. Occasionally you'd see a shadowy figure peeking out from a porch, but that was it. There was a huge park with a nice looking playground that we never saw a single child at. If vampires were real, this is definitely where they'd live. Once, me and my mom decided to drive down a side street in this town just to see what was there. We came across a car repair shop, which was weird because we never saw any cars there, and as soon as we approached, this guy came out. His face was not the shape of a normal human face, it was kind of lumpy. Obviously, some people have facial deformities, nothing scary about that, but there was something so unsettling about this guy. He stormed out and then just stopped and stared at us with the angriest look I've ever seen. It didn't help that this was the only human we'd ever seen outside in a town we'd driven through dozens of times. We quickly noped out of there and never explored that side street again. I was out hiking in Wyoming with my family. We had 2 horses full of supplies and were hiking to several remote lakes by Fremont Lake. It was so remote that we only saw 3 other hikers the entire time we were gone. We used the same trail, going up and coming down. We made it to the first remote lake and stumbled upon an old campsite. They didn't have a tent, but they had sleeping bags that they just left behind, along with a coffee pot and pan still on the fireplace they had built. I didn't think much of it other than that it was odd. Here it was June, and it was cold at night. How did they make it out? We were on a good 3-day hike from any road. It turns out they didn't make it out. A day later, my dad stumbled upon human remains. The authorities were notified. It was missing hikers from several years earlier. They still can't figure out why they left their supplies. Only 1 body was ever found. Hunting, a mile off the road, I got a really creepy feeling. Something or someone was watching me, and more than one set of eyes was on me. I blew it off because, why? I'm a middle-aged male of good size. You would think twice before messing with me, not sure if it's all fat or if the fat hides muscle. So I keep scouting. I see a lady's sock. Kind of weird, but it's old and stuff blows around. About 50 yards further, I see a shoe. Now this gets me thinking, what the heck? Put these together, and someone was having a bad day. I'm still being watched, but I can't place it. The birds are far away now, there is a bit of noise in this part of the woods. I'm getting nervous and feel the trees start closing in on me. I chided myself about letting the imagination run, I'm no coward. So I pressed on. The sock and shoe are older, they have probably been there a while. Walk on and see something else. A pair of women's jeans. Now, I start to freak. I'm too far for anyone to hear me cry for help, and so was she, and someone is still watching me. I can feel it. So I try my best to look further into the woods, and then turn to try and catch a glimpse of the watcher. My 6th sense is going crazy right now, shouting at me to leave. There is no glimpse of the watcher, but deeper in the woods, I spot the shape of a person. Low, like crouched in the woods. I'm no coward, I convince myself to walk over and say hi. That will really confuse them. I take a few steps and realize that that isn't a person, but a lady top on some brush. And I'm done, I'm not waiting to find the body. This is just creepy. The woods are dead silent now. I turn to leave, and about 50 yards away, 2 deer bolt out of the woods and crash away from me. At this point, I don't care about hunting anymore. I ran out of the woods, walked back to my car, left there, and have never been back. That place is in my nightmares sometimes. I grew up in a house that originally served as an old folks' home. At night, the whole house would pop and crack. It sounded like people were walking up and down the stairs all night. My mom was always aware that the house was haunted. My dad said it was just the house settling. The house in 1984 was 100 years old. One night, I woke up to the sound of a door slamming. I walked down the hall and peeked around the corner, looking down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs was a closet. The door was open about 6 to 8 inches, and there was a human face looking at me from inside the closet. I ran into the bathroom and tried to calm down. Finally, I mustered the courage to come out of the bathroom and look down the stairs again. Nothing there. There were many experiences in that house that are harder to explain. My friend and I were camping in November, when the busy camping season had already ended here. We were at a rustic campground that had maybe 5 sites in a little loop, way off from any main road and from any town or residential area. We were the only ones there. There was no sign of anybody else. I know the area pretty well and didn't have any qualms about it. We got set up and had some dinner, but I was feeling awful for some reason. Just anxious and tired and unable to eat much. It was eerily quiet. There was no wind or usual night sounds except for a fox in the distance. So quiet, it hurt my ears. My friend and I went to bed in my little 2-man tent, set up in the trees a ways from my car and the path. Way off in the distance, we heard an engine, and it sounded like it was getting closer and closer, and then it was idling at the entrance to the campground loop. It sounded like an ATV, and the DNR here only uses trucks at campgrounds. We were both frozen and silent. We could see the lights from the ATV through the tent wall. Then it came closer, went around the loop, shined its lights at us for a second, and left. We relaxed a little. Then we heard them approaching again. This time there was more than one ATV. They idled at the entrance for a long time and then drove through again, shined lights at us, and then left. We basically slept in shifts all night because we were scared to get out of the tent to pack up and leave. We called off the rest of the trip and went home the next morning. I used to babysit my niece and nephew when they were 4 and 5 while my sister went to work. She lived down the street from me, so I would walk down in the morning before she left and before the kids woke up. I got there one morning, and after she left, I laid down on the couch. I heard one of the kids run down the hall, and I immediately pretended to be asleep so they would go back to bed and not get the day started yet. I felt my niece run by me on the couch. Her running stomp shook the floor, and I could hear the trinkets on the shelves shake. And I felt the wind blow by me. Then it was quiet, but I knew she was still there. She leaned over my ear, moved my hair out of the way, and laughed in my ear. And I just thought of the audacity of this girl. And then she hid under the end table of the couch. Realizing she wasn't going to go back to bed until I woke up, I just got up and looked under the end table. There was no one there. I was completely baffled at how she got up and out of the living room in literally 2 seconds without my hearing. So I went down the hall to her room and started to freak out. My nephew was sound asleep in his bedroom, and when I got to my niece's room, she was sound asleep, tucked under her covers. My heart almost fell out of my body. When I was a teenager, I went on a hike in south-central Pennsylvania by myself in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a day I was playing hooky, so there was nobody else there at the small trail. At least that I could see. You had to drive there was no foot traffic. I was young and had been talking and singing horsing around the whole time, totally unconcerned. Yelling things off the top of the mountain, etc. On my way down from the mountaintop, I heard my dad's voice call my name and ask for help. I thought I was having a stroke and stopped and almost started to follow, thinking, what is my dad doing here? Did he follow me or something? And then I came to my senses and told myself, my dad is sitting in his office, like an hour or more away. I heard it 2 more times in the space of a minute or 2, call me by name and tell me to come here and help me. It sounded so insistent, like it was urgent, and it was without a doubt my father's voice. I have never run so ducking fast. I used to do this hike in bare feet, and I remember ducking my feet up and hurrying down the mountain. I never went back, and to this day, I don't know what the duck that was. I immediately drove to my dad's office, and he was sitting at his desk working. I don't remember if I told him what I experienced at the time or not. When I was in my early 20s, I stayed the night at 2 of my friends' houses. They broke out the Ouija board around midnight. Almost immediately, the board started spelling out that I needed to leave immediately and how it hated me. I didn't believe in the supernatural aspect of it, but I didn't think it was my friends being that vicious to me either. It just kept sending really horrible messages for about 30 minutes. The final message was that if I had taken its advice and left earlier, I would have died in a car accident. Completely unnerved, I slept between my friends all night in one bed. When I got home the next day, my mom described really bizarre behavior from my cat from midnight until 1 a.m. My Siamese, Toulouse, kept running down our upstairs hallway and flinging herself full force against my closed bedroom door. She also made this really loud, desperate meow. My parents were actually worried she was going to hurt herself because she was so violent. I truly believe that she was trying to get to me to keep me from harm. She never did anything like that again. So for me, we were out chilling and having a few beers by the river. It was getting dark out, so my friends and I wanted to head out before it was too dark to see the trail. On our way back, we saw something. Something that looked similar to a human. We were worried about the person, and if they were okay, we went to shine the flashlight on the person, except there was no face. I didn't see the face because my friend was closer and I was a few feet away. My friend said it looked static when I asked him about it, and the person bolted. I went from laying down to a standing position faster than any human I've seen and ran off. It was tall, too. I was over 7 feet tall. If I had to guess, it was super dark out. The way it ran reminded me of something that was a cross between robotic and the way that the Bionic Man ran. It ran away faster and quieter than a human. All the hair on my body stood on end, similar to the feeling that you would get when a thunderstorm is out. Except that there were almost no clouds out. All of my friends and I were freaked out, and the hair on all of our arms was standing straight up. I never had such a strong feeling of terror and dread before. I farm in a rural town in the western US, and our farm is a ways out of town, so naturally, it's pretty eerie at night. We flood irrigate, so the water needs to be moved from field to field, and those water changes just come whenever the fields are finished. At each end of our farm, there is a big row of trees that once again get kind of eerie at night. So my dad and I were driving down our farm road at around 3 a.m. We reached the row of trees, and as the headlights hit the trees, I saw a strange figure. It looked to be the rough shape of a human, but not quite the same. Taller and more hunched over. Kind of like a 6 feet 3 inch old woman in a shawl. I only saw it for 2 or 3 seconds, but it was long enough to make my blood run cold. I was so freaked out, so I didn't say anything to my dad. About 30 seconds later, my dad started driving faster and looked over at me and said, "I wasn't going to say anything, but did you happen to see a strange figure walk between the trees?" I nodded, and we changed the water and went home. There has been a local legend about a creature that looks like what we saw and has been talked about since the 1940s. It's supposed to be similar to a Native American skinwalker. And it would make sense to me that we have found Indian pottery and arrowheads all over our farm. Neither of us have seen it again, but it is still in the back of my mind when I drive to that corner of the farm. So, my friend and I were hanging out with 2 of her guy friends Friday night after school, and the plans were that we were having a sleepover at my friend's house. We were just hanging out around town, nothing much to do in a small GA town, but we walked around the town square and went to the trails. Well, after shooting the shit for a couple of hours, we got hungry and ordered a pizza for pickup. We got the pizza and drove to a pretty quiet neighborhood where one of the guys lived. The neighborhood was kind of tucked away in a forest, so it was really quiet and really dark in that area of town. As we were sitting there outside, eating pizza, using the hood of the car as a makeshift table, I looked up and saw what looked like a large, pitch black mass that resembled a primate in shape and movement, swinging high in the trees that had to be a good 800 feet away from us. Even from that distance, at night, it looked so huge. But that made no sense, as we live in a small town in Georgia. There are no large primates here. I alerted everyone to this figure in the trees, and we were all baffled and amazed at what we were seeing. I remember just having this sense of dread washing over me as I looked at this figure, trying to make sense of what I'm seeing. Then, it seemed like it noticed us. We couldn't see any distinct features, and the figure was pitch black, but somehow, you just knew that it was watching you. Suddenly, this shadowy, ape-like figure stood tall, and you could almost see it shifting before your eyes as it began to resemble more closely the shape of a large man, holding onto a branch with one arm, just staring at us with unseen eyes. Everyone was frozen, so still, and so quiet. It seemed like the sounds of the night froze in place with us. We were just transfixed by this dark figure in the trees. Then, this creature crouched over, and as it did, its shoulders seemed to stretch impossibly higher, reaching over its head. All of us were in shock and terrified at seeing this, maybe a little in denial, as what we were seeing was defying any logical explanation. You want this to make sense. And then this creature's shoulders, for lack of a better word or better way to explain this, seemed to just grow into these huge wings. Then this dark figure jumped off the branch and flew off. I knew what I was seeing was real because, when that happened, we all ran to the car without talking, just screaming as fast as possible, and sped away from there. We were all freaking out, trying to find any logical reason that could explain what we had just witnessed, but there was none. Needless to say, no one slept that night. We were all too terrified that maybe that thing would follow us back to my friend's house. I should also mention this was back in 2010, so there were no good camera phones to capture whatever we saw back then. This one was not as long, and I was also drinking. But I have 2 other witnesses to back me up. I was basically out at my brother-in-law's house, and it was probably 1 a.m., and I saw some amber red glowing eyes out of his horse tank. My eyes were about 7 feet off the ground, if I had to guess. But the scary thing is that when I saw this and pointed it out, and my brother-in-law and a family friend saw it, I pulled my pistol out, and my brother-in-law grabbed his AR-15, and it ran away like it knew what guns are. Another one from my childhood was when I was at my great-grandma's place for the weekend in a little town in Kansas called Slaughter Water. I woke up, and as any average little boy would, I decided to go outside and play in the dirt. The spot that I was in the front yard on the other side of a rose bush, and after about an hour of digging around, I got that overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. Everything went silent. I started looking around. For context, here my great-grandma's house was across the road, about 75 yards from the Shallow Water Elementary School, which was abandoned before I was born, but I looked up on top of the roof and saw this thing. It was jet black, looked like it had wings, and stood on 2 legs about 5 to 6 feet tall. So I froze up, and me and this thing had a stare down for what felt like forever, but in reality, it was maybe 10 to 20 seconds. It had massive red eyes, almost like a fly. That's the only thing I can really compare it to. But after the stare down, I decided to get up and run as fast as I could back inside to where my dad was talking to my grandma. I was screaming, and apparently I peed my pants. I was absolutely terrified and told my dad there was a monster at the school. He and my grandpa went out looking for guns and didn't find anything. But later that night, while my grandpa was at work and it was just me, my dad, and my grandma, something jumped or landed on the roof of the house. My dad said that by the sound of the steps, it was on 2 legs and weighed over 100 plus pounds, but it runs across the roof, jumps down onto the window air conditioner unit, and runs off into the night. So my dad and grandma stayed up all night locked and loaded with shotguns, absolutely terrified, while I hid in the basement with my dad. 22 revolver. But after that night, we never saw or heard from this thing again. I'd give it was the same creature I saw that was on the school that ran across the roof, but there was and I think still is something evil in that town. I refuse to go back. Well, I refuse to go back without being heavily armed. That is. When I was younger, probably in the 6th grade, I was at one of my dad's fishing camps. This one happened to be a 1987 Dodge Sportsman rotting in some old logging camp about 2 hours north of where I live. I always hated going because my dad always drank there and had a general lack of regard for safety, departing in a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat with a 0-year-old 8.5 horsepower motor while you're hammered with your kid and his friend, for example. One time when we were there, I can distinctly remember bright, consistent flashes about every 3 seconds that lit up half the sky on the horizon. I still don't know what it is. I've seen something similar while tenting at a local campground. It was so dim that it was hardly noticeable, but when I saw it up at the fishing camp, it was almost as bright as lightning. At the local campground, I assumed it was maybe a lighthouse or something because the campground wasn't too far inland from Lake Superior. However, the fishing camp is nearly a 2-hour drive north. I'm going to guess that it had something to do with the nearby Lac des Elish mine. However, now that I'm thinking about it, I think I remember the flashes coming from the east. The mine is to the south. I haven't been there in probably 3 years, and it's been half a dozen since that took place. So that's about all I can remember. It happened to my grandmother, not to me. I was in camp, and there was a guest house for parents who wanted to stay for a while and see their kids, as well as the performance. We did big performances in this camp at the end of every camp shift. My grandmother and dad went there to see me and see the performance. They got there 2 days before the shift ended. I went to them the evening they arrived, we chatted, I ate something, and I went to my room. I visited them the next day, and my grandmother told me what happened to her last night. She couldn't fall asleep last night, so she was reading her ebook for some time, and then she started to fall asleep. She put her hand on the headboard, where the wrist was hanging down. After a while, she feels like someone is beating her on the wrist. This made her wake up, and she raised her head, and a black shadow was standing near her bed. She thought that was my dad, so she asked him if he couldn't fall asleep too. There was no response, so she put her head back on the pillow. When she started to realize that there were no cracking sounds on the floor or the bed, The building is old, so the furniture and the floors were cracking so badly, she started to panic. She immediately raised her head and saw no one. She stood up and went, turning on the bathroom lights. Nothing happened like this during the rest of the night. So one night I'm home alone, I go to bed, and I fall asleep. Later, during the night, I wake up thirsty. So I go downstairs to get a drink. Because our house is older, most of the rooms on the first floor are also pass-through rooms. The kitchen has two entrances, one that connects to the dining room, which then connects to the living room, the front door, the stairs, etc. The other end connects to the back hall and then the back door, garage, and basement. They're on opposite sides, and each has a light switch for the kitchen light. I go into the kitchen and turn on the light switch by the dining room door. I get my drink, put the cup in the sink, and go to leave the room. I turn off the light as I leave, and immediately after, the light turns on again. I assume I just fumbled the switch and went to turn it off again. Except it is off. I turn around and see the switch on the other side of the room. I noped out of there stupidly fast. I closed the kitchen door, threw dining room chairs in a pile against it, triple-checked that all windows and doors were locked, then sped upstairs with my cat and hid on my bed. My cat fell asleep because she's old, I did not. A few hours later, my cat wakes up. At the same time, I hear creaking, which means someone or something is going up or down the basement stairs. My cat hisses in that direction, meaning whatever it is she hates. Typically, she just looks away and flicks an ear if a sound bothers her. The noise stops after the thing finishes going up or down the stairs, but my cat continues to look in that direction even after it stops. Eventually, she goes back to sleep. I still did not. To this day, I don't know what the hell that was. I lived in a haunted house for a year. At this time, it was just me and my 3 sisters. Ages 13, 5, and 2, I was 10. My older sister and I were home from school with a stomach bug. My mom had to go get my 5-year-old sister from school and asked us to watch our youngest sister. We were sitting in the living room, and she was eating some snacks and had a sippy cup of water. The top of the cup must have not been screwed on tight enough because, when she knocked it over, water spilled everywhere. My older sister went to the kitchen to get some napkins to clean it up. When she came back, she handed me some of the napkins, and we both started cleaning. We were on our hands and knees wiping up the water when we started to hear banging coming from the second floor. We both paused, looked at each other, and said nothing. But we both had that look of "you heard that too, right?" We stayed silent and kept cleaning. Then again, another bang. At this point, we stand up and are still silent, just staring at the ceiling. Then came the giggles. We heard little kids upstairs laughing. Then the laughter turned to singing. It sounded like a children's choir singing. My sister scooped up the baby, and we ran outside. It was a clear day out that day, but I remember once we got outside, it started to rain. We had no choice but to go back inside. We stayed on the front porch until my mom got home. We saw things in that house that I still have nightmares about, 20 years later. But for some reason, giggling and singing bothered me the most. About 6 years ago, when I was a kid, I was playing with my toys in my room alone. The rest of my family was in the living room across the house. I was facing the closet, which was about 4 feet in front of me. I saw someone standing over me in the top of my vision wearing flannel, jeans, and boots. I look up from my toys, figuring it was my dad, and the person disappears. I didn't think much of it. I figured the clothes were set up in a way that appeared vaguely humanoid, although I was a bit skeptical because the clothes the man was wearing didn't match anything in my closet. This happened a few more times. I would walk into my room and see someone sitting on the table, but they would disappear once I looked directly at that area. Eventually, after this happening several times a day for about a week, I confronted my mom and explained everything, looking for some comfort or reassurance. She stayed silent for a second, then told me she was also seeing these mysterious figures, specifically for the past week as well. My heart rate fired up as I realized it wasn't just me, and the idea that I wasn't just seeing things solidified. I was genuinely terrified for a while. After talking with my mom, I never saw anything similar again. I was coming home from work one night, and to get to my house, I usually take a route that takes me past an old Civil War graveyard. I was on the phone with my mom at the time because I hate driving alone at night, and I guess being on the phone made me feel a bit safer. All of a sudden, right when I got to the graveyard, my mom's voice cut out mid-sentence, and these weird, guttural noises started coming through my phone. I don't know how to describe it other than to say it sounded like a lot of people talking all at once in a language I've never heard before. At first, I thought maybe something was wrong with my phone, so I decided to restart it. That should have fixed it, right? Sound couldn't possibly come out of it with it off, right? Wrong. When I told you, I almost threw my phone out the window when those noises and voices were still coming out of it. My phone was completely powered off, and the noises and voices were still there. I literally had to take the battery out of my phone for it to finally stop. To this day, I don't know what the hell that was that night, and I don't think I even want to know. Needless to say, I took a different route home after that. About a decade ago, when I was still in high school, I always used to bike to school in the early hours of the morning. My road led me through these beautiful forested areas, past meadows for livestock, and through tranquil country roads. I loved biking there before the sun came up in the winter. The road is split in places. There's one lane for bikes, a small ditch, and a larger lane for forest rangers to drive their cars along. One time I was riding along the bike lane when suddenly, on the car lane, I saw a light. About head level. Very bright, but not blinding. It was slightly behind me and moving at a steady pace along with me. I wasn't scared, more like unsettled, due to how suddenly it had appeared and how it was slowly moving my way. I stepped it up and got out of there. I didn't look back. I rode that road for years and never saw it again. Not long ago, I even hiked there in the middle of the night, hoping to see it again. I figured maybe my returning to the area after so long would trigger it to happen again. Maybe it would recognize me or my intent to see it again. But no luck. It doesn't have to be supernatural. It could have been ball lightning. Even if it was, I feel privileged to have witnessed it. Ball lightning or wisp, it was a unique experience. One I really wish I could experience again. I was camping in the 80s on Bluff Mountain between the Blue Ridge Parkway and the Punchbowl Shelter. This area is part of the Appalachian Trail. Basically, you can camp anywhere off the dirt roads or trails. We were camped about halfway up Bluff Mountain for a week. The second to last day, we decided to do the day hike up to the top of Bluff Mountain, taking our time to explore on the way up. When we got to the top, we saw the old fire tower foundations, did some exploring, and found the Audie Klein Powell Memorial. Remember, this is the late 80s, no internet, so us stumbling around and finding this powerful memorial where a child had died 100 years before us was profound. We stayed for a bit, reflecting on the story and talking about it, then hiked back down the mountain to our camp. That night at our camp, we slept outside our tents because the weather was beautiful and it was our last night. The three of us slept in our sleeping bags lined up next to the fire, a few feet in between each other. We dozed off to sleep. Every night, like clockwork at around 3 a.m., we could hear a train whistle way off in the distance. It was kind of cool because if you happen to be awake, those of you who have roughed it understand that sleeping in tents or sleeping bags isn't the most restful sleep. You knew that the sun would be up in a few hours, and you had a sense of what time it was. I was stirring in my sleeping bag right after I heard the train whistle when I heard something coming. When you camp in places like this, you can hear the slightest sounds at night because there is nothing but animal movement, bugs, etc. I reached over and smacked my buddy on the leg to alert him that something was coming. Keep in mind that it's pitch black in the forest in the middle of the night. Our fire was nothing but a few small embers, so the light it provided was minimal. I wake up my buddy, as the noise is really loud and heading right at us. Noise stops, and standing directly in front of us in our camp in the middle of the night were two men with shotguns and a lantern. They were dressed in overalls and wearing boots and hats. Shotguns were lowered, but still, they had shotguns on us in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. I had the only weapon we brought with us in my hand in my sleeping bag, a CO2-powered pellet gun, which would have had little effect on two guys with shotguns. We brought it to keep animals away. All three of us were shitting bricks out of our minds at this point, and it was like a standoff. Who's going to flinch first? They shined their lantern at us, and we stared at them, waiting for those guns to be raised, which was silently understood by us, that if that happens, all hell's break loose and probably not going to end well for us. Without a word spoken by us or them, they turned around and walked off. None of us spoke to each other until the noise of their movement was far away. We immediately got up off the ground, had a brief what the duck just happened conversation, and made the decision right there in the middle of the night to pack up and hike down to our car. We were off that mountain before sunrise. Years later, I began researching the story behind the memorial and the child who had died on that mountain. I spoke with a few local historians, and they had me speak to a professor down that way who was writing a book about the events of Audie Klein Powell's and his family's history in the area. It was he who told me that he thinks we had a direct encounter with the ghosts of that mountain, an idea that had never crossed my mind. I assumed they were moonshiners or poachers who checked us out. They saw we were young men and no threat, so they moved on. This professor believes we had a ghost encounter because, in his research, he found many similar stories from others in that area over the years. Apparently, As the story goes, search parties worked those mountains day and night looking for this kid who was missing back in 1887 or 88. The professor believes we had one of these encounters with the ghosts of the mountain, still looking for the boy. I was spending the night at my girlfriend's parents' house over the holidays. We were in our 20s at the time, so they didn't care about us sleeping together in the same room. They had recently bought furniture for the bedroom we were sleeping in. It had been her sister's room, but she had committed suicide about a year earlier, so they had decided to redo it. The furniture was all expensive antiques and had been a set, a bed, chair, blanket chest, and a very large armoire with a full-length mirror on the center door, 3 doors on it. The first night there, I bolted up wide awake in the middle of the night, my hair standing up on my neck. As my eyes adjust, I swear I can see a white haze in the chair to my left. As I'm staring and watching, I see the haze rise up, and now I'm looking at an old woman in a long nightgown, literally with an old nightcap on her head, and holding a candle in an old-style candle holder, the kind with a plate on the bottom and a ring to hold it. She slowly crosses the room right at the foot of the bed and disappears into the mirror on the armoire on the right. Needless to say, I never slept in that room again. Since I was a little kid, my nightmares have contained this terrifying child. He has been burned black, and his mouth is blood red. Sometimes, even when I'm awake, I get a thought of him totally out of the blue. It never fails to make me go hot and cold with fear, something my mother used to say meant that someone was walking across my grave. At about 4:30 this morning, I woke up because it sounded like someone had walked into my room. I was still groggy when I got a mental image of that child standing outside my window, staring in at me. My kitten was sleeping right beside me, and he woke up, staring out the window. First of all, Frank is a dummy. He's the only clumsy cat I've ever known, and he's the sort of cat that meows out the window at birds. Frank stood up and arched his back, his tail puffing up, and he growled at the goddamn window. Then he crept across me like he was stalking something and slid onto the windowsill. He stood there, turned sideways, all puffed up for a long time. Nothing else happened, but it creeped me the duck out. When I was a little kid, my family moved to the hills of West Virginia and lived in a small house that was built in the 20s. I hated this house, specifically my room. My room was set up so that my bed was in a corner and my closet was directly across from my bed. Facing the closet, to the right, was a doorway with no door leading into a playroom. The door to leave my room was to the left of my closet on the wall where my bed was. Every night, I sat there, staring at my closet door. My dog, who is a bigger husky, Shepherd, would lay at the door whining to get out of my room as I made her stay with me, which she never did in any other room, even when she needed to go outside. My fearless dog hates being in my room. After a while, the fear didn't get any better. I would beg my parents to let me stay at my grandparents' house, which was next door, or for my dad to stay in my room with me until I fell asleep. I had never had trouble going to sleep on my own, so my parents thought this was just some way to get attention or something. Well, one night, all of this fear and everything else came to a head. I was lying in my bed, pillows stacked up so I wouldn't have to see my closet door, hiding under the covers. I heard my dog yelp. This being odd, I peeked out of the covers and saw nothing. As soon as I laid back down, I heard the handle fall off of my old closet door. The handle falling off wasn't something new, as it was only a front knob and a rod and was found on the floor quite frequently. No one thought a thing of it and would just pick it up and place it back in the hole. When I heard the knob fall, I terrifyingly looked over, and neither I nor anyone else had actually seen it fall before. Since the door was old, the knob kept the mechanism latched so the door wouldn't open. Since the knob was out, the door creaked open like in a horror movie. At this point, I was so scared that I couldn't move, scream, or do anything. My dog at this point was whining very loudly, but not loud enough for my parents in their room to hear. Then she stopped. Just stopped. I looked at the open closet door and saw a small, frail boy with a very large head. All of him was black except for where his eyes should be. He slowly turned and looked at me, and I didn't feel fear, I felt devastation. I felt the most extreme anger, sadness, and intense emotions I have ever felt. It wasn't natural. After what seemed like forever, I bolted out of my room, sobbing, and ran to my parents. My parents never let me sleep with them, so my father took me back to bed and waited until I fell asleep. From then on, I would throw actual fits if I wasn't allowed to stay the night at my grandparents'. On nights I had to stay home, this same experience would happen every single night. I wouldn't sleep if I stayed at my house, so my parents gave in and let me stay with my grandparents most nights. It got to the point where my mom was telling my godmother what was happening, and she offered to bless the room as she was a devout Catholic. After this, things got better for about a week, And then they all collapsed into the same horror show every night. My parents aren't very religious but eventually decided to test it out for themselves. My mother stayed in my room one night and decided that we needed to move the next day. I've never seen that little boy again, but the thought of it brings me to tears. I don't know what it was. I believe in the supernatural. It's kind of hard for me not to. I wasn't the only one to experience this. My old house was tested for any kind of leak or slow poisoning and was clear. After selling it, we found out that the people who lived there refused to use that room, which I found interesting because they never knew what had happened. My sister once dated this guy, whose parents kept this little carousel thing up at the top of a big dish cabinet. I assume it was for Christmas, but it kind of fit there, so they left it. Even though it was pretty high up, if you walked by, it was somehow triggered and went off. It was cute. Then it started to die and was moving really slowly, and the music was kind of deranged, so they took the batteries out and just never replaced them. Every time you'd walk by after that, it still went off. Super slow and super deranged. Then it started going off when you were sitting on the couch way across the room in the living room, not even moving. Completely open room so you can see the entire dining room and living room from either side. This same house also had a strange basement. I've never had issues with basements, except for this one. It was two-sided as half of it was for the laundry area and the other half was a sitting area, I guess, that was separated by a thin wall. Every single time we'd be down there, I felt watched, and the hairs on my skin stood up. I thought it was just me until my sister's boyfriend eventually moved down there, and she said the same thing. It was not pleasant to sleep down there at night. Especially since they were not allowed to leave the laundry light on and there was no door to that room. It looked like a giant black void at night. I am not the only one who has felt watched in that house. Like I said, it feels tame compared to some people's experiences, but it still freaks me out to this day, and I do think about it. I also went to my dad's friend's house when I was really young to play with their kids while the adults hung out. I remember going up to the playroom they had set up for the girl my age, and we both sat down to play with a big plastic doll house, the ones where you could move the staircase up and down, kind of like an attic ladder. We were laughing and having a good old time. Until her mom walked in. I turned and said something along the lines of, "Hi. Beth and I are hungry, can we get a snack?" And she looked at me like I had two heads and asked where I'd seen her because she's been looking for her because it was time for her medicine. Obviously, being confused, I turned around and poof. She's gone. They all thought it was cute because I was little and obviously was playing with my imaginary friend. Yeah, my imaginary friend that looks exactly like your living, breathing child. I later asked my friend why she hid from her mom earlier and asked if it was because the medicine was gross and she had no clue what I was talking about and told me she wasn't hiding. She was outside on the tire swing playing. So, yeah. I was playing hide and seek in the woods in NC in the fall. All the leaves were on the ground, and I was a ways up the hill from everyone hiding behind a tree. I thought I heard someone coming, footsteps on the crunchy leaves, so when I turned to look, there was no one there, but as the sound got closer, I could clearly make out footsteps. This is when it gets really weird, and I promise you, I remember this vividly to this day, and I am not lying. I looked at the ground in the direction of the footsteps, and as clear as day crunching along in the leaves, I watched footsteps crunching leaves into the ground with no physical body there doing it. Just the imprints of someone walking right past where I was hiding and up over the hill. It was not windy, the leaves were not moving anywhere else, there was not even a slight breeze, and the footprints were so clear I probably could have guessed the shoe size. This was about a year ago. I had recently experienced several traumas and was all alone through it all. I would stay up all night because my mind wouldn't let me rest. This was the worst time of my entire life. So I had depression and insomnia. It started out innocent. Every night, a presence, that's what I'll be referring to it as, would visit me and stay for about an hour. Everything in my house would become still. There was a distinct heaviness in the air. It felt like there were eyes watching me from every window and everywhere I went. It was very strange, but not malevolent. Just observing me. Curious even. About 3 weeks after this happened, I noticed the presence at 3 a.m. or a bit earlier. Every single night. After about 2 months of this visiting presence, it became malevolent. It hated me. That heaviness in the air became crushing. It was like it was trying to squeeze out my very breath. It started to scare me. The first night of it being evil and hating, weird shit happened. It sounded like drums were banging. Except I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was like it was coming from every direction and completely surrounding my house. Then it got cold. Real cold. In my house, it was like 53 degrees. I didn't touch the thermostat. This cold and drums went on until the crack of dawn. After 6 months of the malevolent observing me, about 8 months total of observing me, something very strange happened. You need a little bit of context to understand. In my room, my bed is parallel to the wall with the door. There is a window right in the middle of my bed. And the wall next to that has a window too. We have cats who, at the time, were kittens. They would jump up on the windowsills and watch birds. They destroyed my blinds on the window by my bed so they could birdwatch. Only the bottom few blinds were gone. This made me very uneasy. At around midnight one night, I heard a long scratch on the window, not by my bed. I turned around, and nothing was there. There were no kittens, nothing that could have made that noise, and nothing outside. This should have put me at ease, but it put me on edge. The next night, around the same time, there was another scratch. Except it was about 10 inches away from me. It was at the window by my bed. Now remember how I said the kittens destroyed the lower blinds on that window by my bed? This allowed me to see what was scratching my window. All I saw was a hand. If you can call it that, there were 3 long fingers with a long claw attached to each finger. The skin was pale. It contrasted notably with the pitch blackness of the night. This scared the shit out of me. But I stayed calm. The encounter only lasted for about 6 seconds. I thought I was crazy. So the next morning, I went outside to my window. The claw marks were there. They pierced the glass. I knew I wasn't crazy. To this day, I have no clue what to think about any of the events that took place at that damn house. I'm glad I moved. My house growing up was built in the 1920s. While I can think of several things that can be explained by other things, such as sleep paralysis, childlike imagination, creaky pipes, and bad wiring, there are some things that have left me and my family members unsettled. I generally think most hauntings can be explained by natural phenomena, and I'm happy to think this could be the case too. From the moment we moved into the house, I was 6, I absolutely hated my closet. I would cry if my parents didn't close it at night. This fear never went away, even when I was a teenager. I always had to have it closed or covered up. I can't explain exactly how genuinely terrifying this feeling was, but I always felt watched. My whole family was creeped out by that closet too and generally avoided it. The upstairs was small and had a landing surrounded by our 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. I would wake up with this oddly unsettled feeling and walk to the landing and stare down into the darkness of the stairs, which was odd as normally if I had to go to the bathroom I would sprint there and back. A few times I would find my brother already standing there but looking up at our attic door instead, and I'd have a heart attack. The weirdest thing for me was the several times someone in my family heard a voice that sounded like one of us, but we weren't there. There were at least 2 times my dad came into my room, annoyed at me for waking him up when I was deep asleep and completely tangled in my bed sheets. He told me that I tapped him hard on the shoulder and very clearly told him to get up and that I needed help, but when he opened his eyes, I wasn't there, and he had to search for me. My brother told me about times he heard me talking in a room, but when he checked, I wasn't even upstairs. It still gives me chills to think about it. There were also times I clearly heard the door open and my mom come home and call my brother and me, but when we got downstairs, no one was home. It would be really odd, and we'd both definitely heard it, even with headphones in. Sometimes we'd leave the house because we'd be so freaked out by it. There's other odd stories of things going completely missing and us finding them in odd places months later, but I've always just put that down as forgetting where we put them or our cats hiding things. Some of my friends refused to come over after sleeping the night, but they wouldn't tell me anything other than that the place really creeped them out. I was about 16 and home alone one night at my stepdad's house. Everyone had gone out for the night except me. One thing you need to know about this household is that it's in a pretty rural area, in a little village where everyone knows each other and a lot of family members live in the same town. Because of this, no one would ever use the front door. Everyone who came over would just come through the garden, use the back door, and walk right in. So it's about 10 p.m., I'm watching TV, and the doorbell rings. It startled me a bit. Who could that be at this hour? So I look out the window to get a full view of the front doorstep. No one's there. As I'm looking out, the bell rings again, but there's no one there to ring it. My whole body becomes red hot with adrenaline and fear, and I'm frozen to my seat as it rings again. And again. I run to grab my phone to try and call my mom to come home because I'm scared shitless. No answer. The ringing stops. About an hour later, my parents come home, and I freak out and tell them what happened, and I'm pissed at them for not answering the phone. My stepdad chuckles and says, "Oh yeah, that's my wife. It happens sometimes." His previous wife and partner for years and years had died a few years ago. He said he tried to have the doorbell fixed only to figure out there's nothing wrong with it. Their theory is that when the doorbell rings, it's hers, reminding them she's still with them. High school retreat. We had to sleep in some old house overnight that was previously owned by the landowner around the school. Tradition. It was a huge villa-type home. The history of the house was that it was owned by a rich guy who died, not in the home, and his wife donated the home to a cloister of nuns, who converted it into a hospital for TB patients before converting it into a school. There are no records indicating whether anyone died or not or was buried on the grounds. Bear in mind these pre-med records. School staff had stated there were cold spots, whispering, and one woman working late saw a little girl reflected in a bathroom mirror out of the corner of her eye. She turned her back for 1 second only to hear something shatter, only to find the mirror had cracked. So of course with these stories and about 40 plus girls, half who were less than happy to be there and the other half wanting to play Ghostbusters, no one was getting any sleep. My friends and I were in the midst of telling the others to keep it down, when there was a loud slam in a hallway that led to the bathroom. The room went cold, and there was a low, almost growling sound. My hair stood on end. Only the promise from the chaperones that any student found out of bed would be suspended for a day. Keep in mind the home was old and had much of the original furniture and fixtures, so they wanted people not to damage anything, prevented everyone from running out of the room. Everyone eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, the chaperones woke us up angrily, asking why in hell we spent the night running back and forth in the hallway. The thing was, no one had gotten out of their sleeping bags. A friend of mine went to chaperone the next year and asked the ghosts some questions. It turns out there is something there, and I am afraid that she invited more in.